Abibi Fahoudiye and blessings to the ancestors. Is Sean here with a new video, and this video is going to be more of a non-Blacklash episode, more so a general video essay on the topic I've been thinking about with the recent birthday of Malcolm X passing, related to black nationalism, Pan-Africanism, and each respective movements here in the United States and in the diaspora. This video will be a critique of what my view of nationalist or nationalist adjacent movements that claim to be presenting an alternative solution to the white power structure and the conditions subjected to our people, with the main focus of this video being the Nation of Islam, as they are the closest representation of black nationalism in the United States. And afterwards, I'll be addressing the often associated conscious community, which in my view is falsely conflated with nationalism or Pan-Africanism. Before we get started, I wanted to share a couple of new updates, mainly of which I will be pivoting slightly to be focusing more on musical collaborations with fellow Pan-Africanists. As many of you already know, I'm a producer by namesake of my channel, D1 Beats. So I won't be producing as many Blacklash videos as before, as it's very time consuming to research between working a full-time job and making beats as my business. But you will gradually see more video essays along similar topics like this video, along with collaborations and co-releases I do with other Pan-African artists in the meantime. Hopefully in due time, I will periodically do live stream discussions and stuff like that. But with that being said, let's get started with today's video. Now, as I begin, I want you guys to recognize the following examples and parallels that I'm going to be providing, which is going to show the consistent flaws I've seen historically and contemporarily with organizing alternative nationalists or Pan-African solutions for us as African people. Since the end of the Garvey movement in the early 20th century, black nationalists or similar movements, I've noticed, follow a predictable pattern. First, the formation of a faulty ideology based partly on misinformation or lack of knowledge, wrapped up in the guise of black nationalism or black radicalism in response to oppressive conditions. Second, the propagation of that ideology through charismatic spokesperson or speakers who does speaking engagement throughout speaking circuits, hosting multi-hour debates on the street corners or today online, all in the effort to legitimize their ideological position, to raise money and recruit to present their respective black solution. Third, once the movement is formed, corruption and or mishandling of funds occurs as the initial goals are swept aside in pursuit of individual desires and power. This is the pattern I've noticed even in my own personal conversations with aspiring and active organizers over the last several years. Now that I've laid down the foundation of this pattern, which I will call my thesis and theory throughout the video, I will begin this analysis using the Nation of Islam as the primary example of my thesis and how the same pattern will be repeated afterwards in contemporary times. The Nation of Islam, or the NOI, led by Elijah Muhammad, adopted the teachings of NOI founder Farrakhan Muhammad, whose false interpretation of what's considered mainstream Sunni Islam attracted many initial followers as an alternative to what was a rightly perceived oppression of black Americans by the historical legacy of Western Christianity's enslavement of African descendant peoples. Those of us who's familiar with this history already know this and understand the contradiction of using Islam as an alternative given its own longer history of enslaving and oppressing African peoples. But that's besides the point and won't be debating or disputing their ideological claims. More so, I'm going to only be addressing their aims and actions and objectives as an organization, historically. With the understanding of the NOI's goals of building a nation within America, or at least an alternative economic/political autonomy, I'm going to explain how as an organization, the NOI has failed to achieve these purported nationalist objectives and the ripple effects afterwards. During the first 2 decades of the Nation of Islam's history, the organization was not able to pursue these objectives due to Elijah Muhammad not having enough followers or funds to support this vision. As summarized in Carl Evans' biography on Muhammad, he described the conditions of the NOI during this time period, stating, although he established a small temple in Washington, D.C., and held on to a small following in Chicago, neither provided him with enough money to feed his own family, let alone help the less fortunate members of the Nation of Islam. However, the entry of the new member named Malcolm Little, who became known as Malcolm X, became a reformed and active NOI member and minister who changed the financial prospects of the NOI and Elijah Muhammad by not only becoming a personal example of the nation's prescription of treating former criminals and addicts, but also helping propagate the nation's teachings through his speaking talents, engaging in speeches, debates, and recruitment efforts throughout the 1950s period to obtain support and funds for the nation's nationalist aims for Black America. This is further exemplified by Les Payne's work documenting Malcolm X's important contribution to the nation, stating, "The weekly financial and membership reports Malcolm filed to Chicago quantified his regional temples as the fastest growing and his temple number 7 in Harlem as the chief moneymaker, thus increasing the roles of the nation and fattening the coffers in Chicago headquarters." This is where the first example of my theory and thesis is shown as the growth of the nation using the same pattern I explained initially, which will cause problems to arise once those funds, recruits, and resources are accumulated. By the start of the 1960s, the Nation of Islam finally became profitable after several decades in operation. This changed the dynamic of the NOI leadership, preferring to take a hands-off approach to the increasingly dire Black condition of Black America at the time period, with civil rights and Black rebellion emerging.
But he has changed. Changed from religious talks to nationalistic talk. To the point where I told him, meaning Malcolm, that I listened to him when he first started, and I listen to him now. And that I hear a change. He said, "What kind of change you mean?" I said, "Well, your talks when you first started out, caused me to have chills when you speak because of the truth that you were saying. But now I don't feel that anymore." He told his answer to me. He said, "Maybe you have lost your religious or your spirit." I said, "Well, maybe I have, but I'm just letting you know how I feel."
The more activist-oriented Malcolm X found himself at odds with this direction of leadership, as petty internal issues would eventually lead to his expulsion from the Nation of Islam and his eventual assassination by the NOI members and the government. Now, moving forward into the 1970s, my thesis and theory is repeated again. With Elijah Muhammad and his family maintaining control of the nation's assets, the organization becomes embroiled in another internal conflict yet again by the time of Elijah's death in 1975, with lawsuits amongst his legitimate and illegitimate children over inheritance. Furthermore, Elijah's son Wallace, the selected heir apparent of the NOI, led a reform constituency to convert members of the Nation of Islam into Orthodox Sunni Islam, while a significant portion of NOI members preferred the original teachings of Elijah Muhammad as viewed by Louis Farrakhan and Silas Muhammad. The reason why these two incidents are important is because it highlights the unnecessary conflicts that resulted in wasted time by its members and leaders such as Farrakhan in the following decade by not organizing the initial stated purpose of the Nation of Islam in nation building, and follow the same pattern I discussed earlier in my initial thesis. To explain why I claim this is because for Farrakhan to reconstitute the Nation of Islam as it was, he was forced to raise the money to buy the nation's name and assets from Wallace Muhammad. Former members and associates such as Malik Zulu Shabazz, who was an aide to the NOI minister Khalid Muhammad, all of whom to varying degrees contributed to the rebuilding of the nation under Farrakhan during the 1980s, confirms my point in the following excerpts. Starting with Shabazz, he testifies in his biography of Khalid Muhammad, stating, "After the messenger's passing, the Nation of Islam's financial assets and real estate holdings under the control of Elijah Muhammad were decided by judges, probate courts, and the legal rights of the messenger's numerous heirs were dictated. Many of the impressive holdings of the NOI were not set up legally in a way to benefit body membership of the NOI internally into the future, but rather legally ruled as private assets of the messenger." This point is further corroborated by Vibrant White in his work, reflecting the point I said earlier by stating, "With the remainder of the Gaddafi loan from Libya, Farrakhan purchased the Nation of Islam's original flagship mosque from Wallace Muhammad for $2.1 million. The problem with this stretches back to the days of Elijah Muhammad's leadership, where the funds, tithes, and contributions of the NOI members were siphoned off into the private businesses owned by Muhammad's family and his personal possessions of the organization's assets. A true organization would not have to buy back assets to what it already contributed to for several decades up until the death of Muhammad. Unfortunately, this pattern would be continued by Farrakhan as he rebuilt the nation during the 80s. This brings us into the period of the late 1980s into the 1990s, where my thesis and theory is proven again. By this time period, Farrakhan was successful in the efforts of raising funds, recruits, and resources to rebuild the Nation of Islam through the speaking circuits and by charging speaking fees with the help of key members such as Khalid Muhammad and others. During this time period, to drum up support and visibility from the black community, at least in my opinion, Farrakhan's rhetoric against the Jews and Zionists ramped up during his speeches and interviews, which would cause significant problems later. As the nation was finally able to regain ground by the start of the 90s, Farrakhan repeats the same pattern of corruption as his teacher Elijah Muhammad. From siphoning off excessive tithes from NOI members, engaging with dealing with the Arabs for loans such as the Gaddafi loan, to the controversy surrounding the fundraising around the 1995 Million Man March, Farrakhan adopted the same business model as his teacher by enriching himself while claiming to raise these funds for black development. Out of the many examples provided by Vibrant White, he goes into detail about one of the initial problems with the nation's fiscal situation in the 80s, stating, "Many of the nation's financial problems started in 1985 with the announcement of the economic program titled People Organized and Working for the Economic Rebirth, or POWER. Financed with a $5 million loan from Gaddafi, Farrakhan envisioned that it would become a $1 billion personal care enterprise. However, before the program could get off the ground, Farrakhan used the loan to purchase homes for himself and his children that amounted to more than $2 million. The remainder of the Libyan loan went into travel, entertainment, and lavish living that culminated in the excess of over $800,000 between 1986 and 1987. The travesty is that Farrakhan and the nation amassed millions of dollars that they had literally thrown away on individualized arrogance. In the midst of all of this mess, the Nation of Islam and Farrakhan's credibility took another hit amongst nationalists and the wider black community after the expulsion of another key member such as Khalid Muhammad, who was removed from the organization after repeating many of the same harsh Jewish/Zionist remarks during a speech in 1993 in which Farrakhan had often made similar statements prior to the controversy. Khalid played a significant role in assisting Farrakhan and the nation during his rebuilding efforts during the late 70s into the early 90s, and was widely respected amongst nationalists who were hopeful for the reconstituted Nation of Islam, as explained in Malik Zulu Shabazz's work. With that being said, all of these events, looking at it through a macro level, in my opinion, further damage the credibility of any aspiring nationalist or black Afrocentric movement in the years and decades to come. Also, and not to forget, the significant political losses took in the 60s and 70s by the loss of Malcolm X and other freedom fighters like Assata Shakur and others due to COINTELPRO. In my view, the overall black community has come to look at those who claim to be conscious or pro-black with skepticism or potential hustler, or label those who purport to be nationalist or Pan-African as Hotep in a derogatory manner, due in part to the notable failures of an organization such as the Nation of Islam, whose founding and history was centered on building this black alternative system, which ultimately has become the black Islamic version of the black Christian church hustle we've seen over the last couple of decades. In the years since the Million Man March, we've seen the rise of the associated conscious community, which, under the similar veil of black nationalism and intermixing similar pseudo-Afrocentric theology of the likes of the Nation of Islam, created more cast of characters that fuel this black fragmentation. Whether it's the Nuwapians, whose founder Dr. York led a pedophile operation in which he's still in prison for, or the internal splintering of remnants of the new Black Panther Party, or in the modern day, the drifts of a Brother Polite or charismatic spokespersons like Dr. Umar Johnson, all of which follow the same formula and thesis I presented earlier in the video. The only difference is that people like Umar operate more on an individual level and not organizational, espousing rhetoric under the veil of black nationalism, black liberation, and Pan-Africanism in interviews and touring speeches, but ultimately not fulfilling the lofty goals or aims that they set out to do, and prefer to enrich themselves off of donations and contributions. In conclusion, it is my opinion that this is partly why I have doubts that any real nationalist alternative will be possible, at least in the United States. There's mutual distrust amongst black people who has been disappointed by past failures, along with increasingly fragmentation of our people's consciousness and identity, with the rise of groups like American Descendants of Slaves, or ADOS, or FBA, or Foundational Black Americans, which in my view is going to be difficult to build any tangible black unity amongst black people as we head into turbulent times. I am concerned about the state of black America, Because as Western, or particularly American hegemony, weakens geopolitically and the rise of fascism in the overall Western world, I do not believe our people will be ready for the backlash that will be coming in the next decade and beyond. But with that being said, I still remain firm in my own vision for development for us as Black African people, for at least those of us who haven't lost our minds yet, and will be committed to creating this alternative for the race. To close out this video, I'll be using Kwame Ture's wisdom as a reminder for us. Until next time, Abibi Fahudie, and blessings to the ancestors.
But one of the categories which interests those of us who are concerned with advancing humanity the most is that between the conscious and the unconscious. This division between the conscious and the unconscious must be properly understood. The people instinctively love freedom, and they will instinctively fight for freedom. But you cannot win freedom on instincts. You can only win freedom on reason. Therefore, the unconscious are those who react on instinct. The conscious are those who react on reason. The job of the conscious is to make the unconscious conscious.